Hello and welcome to CinemaSlice Education. This is part 3 of the history of film that we're doing for the Eduqas Film Studies GCSE Component 1 or Paper 1. It's part of Section B, which is a multi-part question. It's only worth 5 marks, but they're 5 marks that everybody wants. And this list of things focuses on developments in film and film technology over the history of the art form. So what we start off with from the exam board was 10 points of information. We've worked through points 1 to 6 and now we're at points 7 to 10, which runs from the 1950s till today really. We're going to cover things like 3D cinema, widescreen cinema, lightweight cameras, the invention of the Steadicam, and CGI, not GGI as I've mistakenly written there. We're going to take some notes and answer some frequently asked questions as we go through. So what do you need to hand? Make sure that you've got your note paper or your exercise book that you were working on. You can continue from the previous notes that you made. Make sure that you've got a place to watch this video and write the notes at the same time. And you'll need a separate piece of paper for the quiz that we do at the end. If you could write the heading into your book, Film History Part 3, at the top of your notes, and the pause sign will be on, so you can do that now. So let's start. In the 1950s, for point 7, we got the rise of television, and that had a pretty big effect on cinema. The arrival of mass television ownership, especially in America in the 1950s, prompted a massive decline in cinema attendance, and the movie studios, the ones that we looked at in previous episodes of this, they were panicking really badly, and they decided that they were going to try and invest in some different ways to get people to leave their homes and go to the cinema, because people were just staying home and watching TV all the time. So they decided to invest in things like 3D and some other slightly mad gimmicks, and they even tried widescreen and really wide screens, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. So first of all, we've got 3D technology and all of the weird gimmicks that went with it. 3D technology is quite complicated to explain, but the early 3D, it's a little bit simpler. We had the golden era of 3D, as it's known, in 1952 to 1954, and it was stereoscopic 3D. And that's where you get two images that are being projected at the same time, and you have a pair of glasses, and you've probably seen these with different coloured gels in them, and your brain sees one image through one of the gels and one image through the other of the gels, and it sort of constructs this illusion of depth, this idea that you can see something in a more rounded way, and that's the early 3D. What about these other gimmicks though? Well, I've decided to pick a little case study here. There was a man called William Castle, and he came up with gimmicks all the time. And one of them is a poster of the film Mr. Sardonicus on the left-hand side there. He used to come up with different things like vibrating seats for the Tingler, flying skeletons, and in Mr. Sardonicus there was a voting system. So when you went to watch it in the cinema, you could hold up a sort of banner that was given to you, and it would say to the projectionist whether or not you wanted to see Sardonicus killed at the end of the film, or whether or not you wanted to see him live. Now, I think that people only ever saw the Sardonicus death scene because audiences are very cruel and they wanted the bad guy from this film to die, apparently. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but wider screens were one of the ways that cinema producers and film producers could get people to leave their homes and stop watching telly all the time. So they started off in the movie studios with the Academy ratio. So from about 1932, they had this agreed on ratio of 1.37 to 1, which is sometimes called the sort of classic. It's very close to the classic TV ratio that you can see in the diagram on the left-hand side. And they'd agreed on that, and it made it really easy for them to exchange cameras and equipment whenever they needed to. If everybody was projecting at the same ratio, it was really simple. And that was part of the studio system's agreement amongst each other to keep it simple. But as you moved into the 1950s, you got things like Cinerama and CinemaScope. Now, I know my measurement for CinemaScope on there is 2.66 on the right-hand side of the screen, and on the left-hand side of the screen, there's a CinemaScope that says 2.33. CinemaScope was actually alterable, and the upper limit of it was 2.66 to 1. However, by the end of the 1950s, You also got 70mm film, this huge type of film that you could record on, and you could project it up to 2.76 to 1, and it wouldn't lose any of the fidelity of the screen. It would look really, really crisp and clear. Ben-Hur was a famous film that was released having been filmed in 70mm. So what questions do I usually get asked? This is the key questions part of it, where I put the frequently asked questions. What happened to 3D? Well, it sort of disappeared after the 1954. It would make occasional leaps back into the cinema now and again. There was a few bits in the 70s and the 80s, and then there was a really big leap to 3D when new 3D came out, and there was a more advanced version of 3D. The technology had moved on quite a lot, and home 3D often has active shutter glasses. These are 3D glasses that have the 3D element take place in the lenses of the glasses themselves while you're watching the film. Very complicated, and I have no way of explaining that to you because I don't fully understand it. I often get asked, what is IMAX? That is the biggest screen that we hear about at the moment. IMAX is a type of 70mm film that is run through the projector horizontally rather than vertically. So if you imagine a film camera has the film moving through from bottom to top, or top to bottom, I can't quite remember. The IMAX camera has it moving through horizontally, and it gives them a little bit more scope, but they have the perforations along the top of it. Digital film then. Digital film and how 3D works and how digital film projection works is really complicated. I'm not going to go into it in detail right here, just to say that you, with a larger quality image, you can project it much more, but it requires an awful lot more memory. So cameras these days that record in digital, they need huge memory compartments, and I know from meeting a few people who work in the industry that they go through hard drives like it's nobody's business. So notes that we need to make, and the pause sign will come up in a moment so you can make these notes. I'll just talk through them. Point number 7 is the 1950s. It's widescreen and 3D technology emerging. It is due to the response to that growth of television that I talked about earlier. It's really important you make that note because cinema attendances were declining. Right, moving on. Point number 8 takes place in the late 1950s, and it's really specific about this on the list. It says late 1950s, but this is when lightweight cameras made an appearance. So lightweight portable cameras were produced, and they were among the first that were suitable for handheld filming, and this had a huge impact on documentary filmmaking because you could kind of go anywhere and film anything, and you didn't have to lug huge amounts of equipment around with you. You just needed one of these handheld cameras, and it also made way for the birth of what's called the French New Wave, which we'll have a look at in a moment. The French New Wave then, so you had this group of French film scholars and writers, I guess you could call them, among the first people who decided to study film, and they wrote for this magazine in France called Cahiers du Cinéma, which is really famous. They started to make films, and they experimented with film form. We're going to watch a really small clip from a film called A Bout de Souffle, or Breathless in English, because my French pronunciation is absolutely terrible. So here we are. This is Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard, released in the 1950s, and it's a revolutionary film. We're looking at just a static shot right now. I've got it on mute. You don't need the sound for what we're looking at. This is Jean Seberg in the car. She's an American actress, and pop, she just is in a different time now. That single cut that stayed in the same position but moved through time, and there it is, it's done it again. This was seen as completely revolutionary filmmaking because it moved between these different time zones. It didn't move to look at the person she's talking to in the car or anything like that. I know it seems really simple, but this was quite revolutionary for the time it was made. Moving on then, what are the key questions that I usually get asked about this particular era? Were there documentaries before, like handheld cameras? Yes, there was. Documentaries been going since around about the start of cinema, you could say. It's just that these lightweight cameras made it so much more easy to go and just interview someone or go and film someone doing what they were doing. The original documentaries were quite heavily staged. Were they popular, these new documentaries? Yes. Direct cinema, it was called. Like, you had new access to people. It was very direct. It cut out the middleman of having to set up a soundstage or anything like that. And what about the French New Wave? Was that popular? Well, I don't think it was particularly popular financially. I think it was popular financially in France, but not in America as such. But in terms of the effect it had on filmmakers who came along later, the French New Wave was huge. It showed that you could break some of the rules that the Hollywood studios had been using for years, and you could find new and different ways of doing things. Right, our notes to make for this. So this is point number 8. The pause sign will come up in a minute, so you've got time to write down these notes. It is the late 1950s. Please put the late 1950s and lightweight portable cameras. You've got to get those two words, lightweight and portable. Suitable for handheld use. That's another important word. Lightweight, portable, and handheld use for these cameras. And, as an additional note, they were very much more affordable than they used to be. Prices just kept coming down and down and down. It had a huge impact on documentary film, and you need to write down that the French directors from the French New Wave got hold of them as well. So please make sure you've got all of those notes. Moving on to point number 9 then. In the 1970s, you get the invention of the Steadicam. And this is a really exciting point. The picture on the left there is cameraman Garrett Brown on the set of The Shining, a film which uses the Steadicam a lot. And he launched this invention in 1975, and it kind of revolutionized the way camera moves. And we're going to have a look at a clip in a moment of Garrett Brown's first test footage that he made with his Steadicam that he invented. So before you had a Steadicam, you used to have a camera that was on what's called a dolly, which is a big, imposing sort of frame that you could put onto a track, and you could move it along on the track, or it just stayed still. Those are the two things. Or you could put it as handheld, but it would be heavy, it would be a bit tricky to move around, and you would often get sort of really jerky, wobbly footage. You'd have to stay as still as possible to get anything resembling nice, even, still footage. Garrett Brown designed this rig, this sort of weird vest that hooked up to this system of weights and gimbals and gyroscopes and all of these complicated pieces of machinery I don't fully understand. And he sent all the test footage that he filmed to some major studios, and the directors who saw it were really, really keen to get their hands on this equipment. Now, the picture you've got on the left-hand side there is a really modern, up-to-date Steadicam. It's not the original one that Garrett Brown came up with, and you can see it's got a little viewer at the bottom, a series of weights, and it's attached to that person. It'll be quite heavy, but it will give you this smooth footage. We'll have a look at the original tests right now. So here's Garrett Brown running like his life depends on it with this very strange rig on. There he is, running over the hill. And you can see how still the camera is whilst he's running towards you, even though his body's shaking all over the place while he's running. And this is footage of his daughter running down the steps in Philadelphia, made famous by a certain later film called Rocky. And you'll see that even though he's going down all these steps and his body should be sort of wobbling up and down all over the place, it's not. It's really, really smooth because of the invention of the Steadicam. And this was a really, really liberating experience for filmmakers. They could film in a whole new way. So the Steadicam, what questions do I ask? Why is this so important? Well, it kind of changed the way that the camera could be moved around and kept on that smooth, sort of even keel. Before, you had to lay a track, and if you laid a track to roll the camera along, you always had the problem of the track getting in the shot. So you would be trying to move straight forward, and you would have to see the track in front of you whilst you were moving straight forward. So it meant that you had a limited amount of ways that you could point the camera, different ways that you could angle the camera. So this Steadicam really freed camera operators up, and then it meant directors could do some different alternative ways of filming. Has it changed? Yes, you saw that Steadicam that Garrett Brown used, and then you saw the one that was in the picture as well, and they are very different pieces of machinery. Is it still used? Yes, it's used a lot, although nowadays you have what's called the virtual digital camera. If you've got a lot of digital elements, CG elements in your film, then you can use a lot of creative, very fancy pieces of software, and they'll kind of move a camera through all of these digital spaces in very clever ways, but the Steadicam still gets used a lot. So notes that we need to write down. The pause sign will come on in a moment so you can get all of this down, but I'll just run through them. This is point number 9. It's the 1970s. It's the Steadicam. Please get down the date that he released the Steadicam, though. I know it says the 1970s in the headline bit, and you do need to write that down, but he actually released the Steadicam in 1975. And also make sure you get down his name, Garrett Brown. He was a cinematographer and he's a fairly important person. What is it? It's a stabilizing device for handheld cameras, and it keeps a really steady image with fluid movement. You need to get down all of those things. All of those things are key words, and we'll see you for the last part in film history. So, point number 10, 1990s onwards, and it's CGI. What does that mean? Well, that means computer-generated imagery, and it's become really widespread. There's a picture of Avatar on the left, which is a huge CG film. It uses so much computer-generated imagery. Computer-generated imagery was pioneered by a company called Industrial Light and Magic, and they're very important. They're known as ILM most of the time, and they started in the 1970s when they were making Star Wars, and they are still going today. This era of filmmaking saw a move away from special effects, which are things that you do on set and you film them, to visual effects, which is part of the editing process, and I'll go into more detail on that later. You also got full CGI characters in films, like these guys in Avatar on the left-hand side. So I'm just going to quickly talk about what is CGI. It's computer-generated imagery, and if you look at those two pictures on the left-hand side, the picture on the bottom is, these are aliens from different films in the Alien franchise. The picture on the bottom is completely CGI of that alien, and the picture on the top is it's a puppet or a model, and there's a subtle difference in the way they look. Now the one on the bottom does look really, really good. It looks really realistic, and you can see the motion blur on the tail in the background and how that's out of focus. It all looks really, really cleverly put together, like it's as real as it can look. So here's the difference. You've got SFX, special effects. Those are effects that are live. They're on set, they're filmed. They're usually puppets or what's called animatronics, which are these electronic puppets that you can move around. Or you get monsters and makeup and things like that. A little bit like the one in the top that's scaring Sigourney Weaver just there. Visual effects are done after the film has finished what's called principal photography. So when they've stopped the camera rolling and they go towards the editing process, then you get visual effects put in, which is where you get all the guys with all of those computers making sure that they're working night and day against terrible deadlines so that you can see a semi-believable alien on your screen. What about this company, Industrial Light and Magic? So from the 1970s onwards, when they were working on Star Wars, they started to work on a lot of films to do with Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, and in 1985, they created the first freestanding CGI character. And this was for a film called Young Sherlock Holmes, which I liked a lot when I was a child. I've watched it recently with my kids, and it's pretty scary in a lot of ways. But I'm going to show you a tiny, tiny clip from it. I'm going to have to be really careful because you can get caught on copyright with these modern films. I'm going to show you a tiny bit of it when this CGI knight turns up. And it's still, to my mind, pretty impressive looking. Not like that fuzzy picture on the left-hand side. It's a pretty impressive looking character. So here we are. This poor priest has been poisoned by a dart, which is making him hallucinate. And he hallucinates that the stained glass window jumps down and becomes a freestanding character that is going to walk towards him and attempt to kill him. And you get this really impressive shot where the camera rotates around in just a second, and it still looks pretty good. It still holds up. It looks like a load of shards of glass have come to life and they're walking towards this priest. Oh, he's in trouble. So what questions do I get asked? VFX, why is visual effects part of editing? Anything that takes place after the point where you've done post-production that isn't sound, so after the point where you've stopped filming and it isn't sound, that is editing. And that is why VFX, bizarrely, is part of editing, and special effects are usually part of the mise-en-scène and sometimes the cinematography as well. Are special effects still used? Yes, you get lots of puppets and animatronics used, and they're often cited as working best when VFX and SFX are working together. And a really good example that people always talk about is Jurassic Park, because in Jurassic Park they had lots of models and they also had bits of CGI in there as well, and they tried to make the move between the two as seamless as possible. Which is better? That usually depends on your age. I really like special effects, but I am increasingly impressed by what visual effects people can do. And if you watch the Corridor Crew videos on YouTube, you'll see some amazing work that people can do on visual effects these days. So, what are the notes that we've got to make? And there's a few for this one because there's a few pieces of detail and information that you need to make sure that you've got. So, the pause sign will come up in a minute to make sure that you've got time to get them all. Number 10, from the 1990s onwards, CGI, computer-generated imagery, and it's really widespread use. Make sure that you get the details down for Industrial Light and Magic and how they started their work in the 1970s. And also make sure that you put down that we moved away from special effects and towards visual effects. And the last point, we got fully CGI characters in films. Right, it's time for our quiz. That means it's time for you to put away all of your notes and get your separate piece of paper out. I'm going to put some questions up on the screen. What have we got here then? Name 2 of the techniques used by producers to attract audiences in the 50s. In which decade did lightweight portable handheld cameras become available? Got those 3 words in there, lightweight, portable and handheld. Who invented the Steadicam? Can you remember that guy's name? And name the company who pioneered CG use from the 1970s onwards. I'll put the pause up. I'll give you a minute to write down those answers. Right, here we are. So, question number 1, it was 3D and widescreen that cinemas were experimenting with mainly. The decade in which handheld cameras became available was the 1950s. I know it's late 1950s on the timeline, but we can get 1950s. We'll still get a mark for that. Garrett Brown was the man who invented the Steadicam, and Industrial Light and Magic, or ILM. You can get a mark for ILM as well, with a company who pioneered CG use. Right, that's all from me. My name's Mr. W, and this has been Film History. That's all 3 lessons on that. We're going to move on to do some different things on this YouTube channel to do with film studies education. Give us a like and a subscribe, and you can see what all the things that we're going to work on in the future. Bye-bye.